I remember at one time in my life when I had different toxic people in my life, and I remember thinking that something was off. Something was wrong with this person, something wasn't right, and I was actually looking up information and trying to understand it. I stumbled across the DSM, and I'm thinking, okay, there's got to be something that describes what I'm seeing in my life, and yet nothing seemed to click. Every now and then I would find something that had certain characteristics that I was seeing, but nothing really hit home, right? It wasn't until I stumbled upon a letter that somebody had written to someone else, and she was describing what she was going through in her personal life. She was describing herself. And as I'm reading this letter, I'm literally thinking, did I write this? Did I send this in and now it was published and somebody's reading my exact feelings? Up until that point, I had never come across anyone or any explanation for what I was going through until I read her feelings. And that's what started my own journey towards understanding what narcissistic abuse is, what complex PTSD is, and how to heal. So a question that I get from a lot of people is, well, Michele, do I have complex PTSD or do I have what I've heard of as being narcissistic abuse victim syndrome? Or narcissistic abuse syndrome. I've heard it both ways. And a lot of people are just trying to figure it out. And there's a lot of terms being, tossed around on these communities, and it can get pretty confusing. So in this video, I wanted to talk a little bit about narcissistic abuse victim syndrome, what it is. I'm going to mention 20 or so characteristics of it. I'm also going to put a link to a video that I did in 2017. Now, it's kind of hard for me to watch those videos because I feel like I've come so far from that time, but I talked about narcissistic abuse victim syndrome in that video, so I'm going to give you that link, and I'm also going to talk about complex PTSD, but the most important, valuable piece of this video is really information or resources on what you can do if this information resonates with you. And that's always at the end of the video where I provide information on what can help. So with that in mind, let's get started. My name is Michele. I'm a life coach, and I put up as much free information as possible to help people work through toxic relationships, to develop healthy relationships, to overcome complex PTSD. But if you feel like you need more assistance, more personal one-on-one assistance, make sure you check out my website. I have different resources that are really powerful for anyone that's on their healing journey. Okay, so let's first start talking about narcissistic abuse victim syndrome. And I want to state, first of all, that this doesn't exist anywhere except in these communities. That term, narcissistic abuse victim syndrome, narcissistic abuse syndrome, there's no therapist, no psychologist that's going to talk about this term because it doesn't exist, and quite frankly, they probably can't stand the fact that it's getting tossed around so much, and it's understandable. So with that in mind, understand that nobody's going to diagnose you with this. This is not something that you can get diagnosed with. So if it's not something you can get diagnosed with, then why do we talk about it on YouTube? Why do people refer or use this term? It's because people that have been through narcissistic abuse and they hear Cptsd, it doesn't resonate with them. Not immediately, at least. I remember when I was first out of one toxic relationship in the past, I remember somebody telling me, Michele, I think you might have PTSD. And the reason she said that was because she could see that something was off, and most notably was the fact that I was numb. Like, I had no feelings. It was as if somebody had turned the knob on my emotional state and turned it off. I couldn't feel. It was like I was watching my body, I was detached. And that's a sign or one characteristic of PTSD. Now, when she said that at that time, I had no idea what narcissistic abuse was, really. Not fully, at least. And I could see the detachment, but PTSD didn't resonate with me. So the reason we talk so much about narcissistic abuse syndrome is because of the fact that when you're healing, and you're hearing these cluster of characteristics together, it's helpful because it helps you to know what's going on in your life. In fact, without that knowledge, life can be really confusing, and you stay stuck in that mental fog. But I want to say that a syndrome is not a disorder. And I'm going to read to you what a syndrome is right from the dictionary. A syndrome is a group of symptoms which consistently occur together, or a condition characterized by a set of associated symptoms. Or it could be a characteristic combination of opinions, emotions, or behavior. So it's not a disorder, it's just a cluster of characteristics that happen due to a specific circumstance. And in this case, we're talking about narcissistic abuse. Now, years ago, when I was seeing a psychologist to overcome narcissistic abuse, he told me something that most therapists don't tell their clients. He said, you know, I think, it was just his opinion, he wasn't diagnosing, but he said, I think that you're in a relationship with somebody that might have NPD. And I was like, well, how can you say that? Because normally a therapist can't, you know, diagnose or even give that opinion unless they've met the person. And his response, and if you've watched my videos from years ago, you know what I'm going to say because I used to say this in my old videos. His response was, just like an animal tracker doesn't have to see the animal to know what animal passed through. It could tell by the tracks. He said somebody that has NPD, or that's very high on the scale of malignant narcissism, leaves their tracks in the person or people in their lives that they leave behind. So in a sense, he was referring to the characteristics that I had, the cluster of characteristics that I had that was giving evidence that I had been around a malignant narcissist who obviously was leaving their tracks behind, in a sense. And it's knowing these characteristics that has helped so many people break out of that fog. Because if you're with a malignant narcissist and you're trying to understand what's going on, you're with somebody that's gaslighting you into thinking that everything that's happening is normal. And the fact that you don't think it's normal means there's something wrong with you. And you're being fed that over and over, so it's very confusing. But when you stumble upon this information where suddenly someone reads a list of characteristics that sound as if this person knows you, it's really powerful because it helps the person to see that what's going on is not normal. There's information to help, and if that's the case, then there's hope. Okay, so I'm going to read a list of symptoms that characterize what is known in these communities as narcissistic abuse victim syndrome, and you can be your own judge as to whether or not these resonate with you. Brain fog, loss of self-identity, inability to trust your gut instinct, full of self-blame, drenched in toxic shame, battling emotional flashbacks, social anxiety, a harsh inner critic, fear of abandonment, self-abandonment, a highly triggered fight or flight response, anxiety or depression, need for external validation, people-pleasing, lack of self-love, adrenal fatigue, cognitive dissonance, constant rumination, feeling like you're going crazy, dissociation, walking on eggshells, feeling like an empty shell, and a shattered self-esteem. Here's one of my first videos where I talked about narcissistic abuse victim syndrome. So you can check that video out. I kind of feel like I was a totally different person at that time of my life than where I'm at now, but the information is really good. The interesting thing is when somebody has those cluster of characteristics and they want to get help, they don't go to get help saying, hey, I have narcissistic abuse victim syndrome. Normally, they don't, especially when they haven't stumbled across, videos like this. They go to a therapist the way I went to a therapist. And I was like, I'm totally messed up. I am so screwed up. I need help. Like, I am a disaster. And of course, he laughed and was like, oh, tell me, Why are you such a mess? And I talked about all the things wrong with me. That's what most victims of narcissistic abuse do when they don't understand this information. And the sad thing is that when they do that, the therapist then is trying to help them be better and try harder. If the individual doesn't recognize that they may be in a relationship with a narcissist, then it's unlikely at most times, because my therapist was amazing, but it's unlikely. I hear a lot in my face-to-face coaching of people telling me, I had therapy for years. Why didn't they ever mention that this might be a possibility, that it's not me, that I am doing all I can, and that this other person has a problem? So the person winds up in a situation where the therapist is taking that hamster wheel where the victim is already running and trying harder and harder, and he's spinning it faster and faster, trying to get the victim to somehow be better and better to please an unpleasable person that has a disorder. So that's why so many of us that have been through it, that's why we talk about it. That's why we share information, so that you can understand that yes, we all need to look at ourselves, and yes, we all want to better ourselves, and we want to improve, and we want to get healthier, but it should be reciprocal, and both parties should be doing the same effort or giving the same effort to improve. It shouldn't just be one person doing all the work and the other person with a whip, trying to get that person to even be better and better. Okay, so that's narcissistic abuse victim syndrome, but is that CPTSD? And this is where it gets a little bit interesting. So most people that have been through narcissistic abuse wind up with CPTSD. It's just that that term isn't always something that a victim of narcissistic abuse identifies with quickly. Okay, I'm going to talk about that, and then I'm going to talk about how they're different as well. So with complex PTSD, and I'm going to read this directly out of Pete Walker's book entitled Complex PTSD, From Surviving to Thriving. And he describes complex PTSD. He says, CPTSD is a severe form of post-traumatic stress disorder, but it's differentiated from PTSD by 5 of its most common and troublesome features. The first one is emotional flashbacks. Now we know with PTSD flashbacks that there's always a visual component. When somebody has a PTSD flashback, they know why. They know this sound reminds me of that, and this is why all of these feelings are coming up. They understand that. But emotional flashbacks, unlike PTSD flashbacks, there's no visual component. And oftentimes, you have no idea why. So it's extremely confusing on top of the fact that it feels absolutely awful. So that's a difference, the emotional flashbacks from PTSD flashbacks. Toxic shame, self-abandonment, vicious inner critic, and social anxiety. Those are the 5 most common features of CPTSD. They're not the only features, but they are the most common. So CPTSD is not in the DSM, but it is in the ICD, which is the International Classification of Diseases. In my opinion, and this is just my opinion, most people that have been through prolonged narcissistic abuse wind up with CPTSD. But the difference is in CPTSD and what people think of as narcissistic abuse syndrome is obviously the fact that narcissistic abuse victim syndrome or narcissistic abuse syndrome is specific to being in a relationship with a narcissist, whether it's a parent to child, sibling, coworker, long-term friend, or significant other. Whereas with CPTSD, it's not just caused by somebody that's a malignant narcissist. Okay, CPTSD can be from any prolonged stress. It could be from a physically abusive relationship, or maybe the person is an alcoholic or a drug addict, and they don't have a mental disorder, but they have an addiction, and they're causing you physical and or mental anguish for a long period of time. It could also be due to sexual abuse, or even in some cases, I've come across some of my clients where they have a great relationship with their parent. Their parent isn't a bad person, their parent isn't toxic, but that parent was a single parent that had to work really hard and long hours, and the perception of the child was, I don't matter. So growing up feeling like I don't matter, I'm not important, no one is here for me, over a long period of time can cause CPTSD as well. So it's not limited to one specific cause, whereas narcissistic abuse victim syndrome is. I've been talking more and more about CPTSD because I feel like when you get stuck talking about narcissistic abuse syndrome, sometimes your focus gets stuck on always looking at the toxic person, always learning about the toxic person, and always learning about all of those characteristics of the narcissist, of what happens to the victim, but there's no shift towards solutions or healing. So I like to talk about CPTSD because the awesome thing about it is if you do identify with either narcissistic abuse syndrome or CPTSD, the awesome thing is that it's not permanent. You don't have to suffer forever with CPTSD. So if you feel like you identify with either one of these topics, narcissistic abuse syndrome or CPTSD, there is help out there. Find somebody that resonates with you. Find somebody that you feel comfortable with, and you can start creating a solution-focused healing plan. And that's what all good life coaches are trying to do for people that have gone through this. And if you're with a coach where you find yourself always only talking about the toxic person, and the focus is learning or talking about the patterns that you see in them, what they do wrong, what they do that is abusive. Now, obviously, those topics have to be touched on, but if that's the only thing you're focusing on, then that information is valuable, but if you stay stuck in it, it's not going to help you to move forward. So make sure you find somebody that is solution focused and that can help you to move forward. So I hope this helped you to understand the difference between narcissistic abuse syndrome and CPTSD. And if you're interested in any of my services to work personally with me, they are always in the description box below.